Good morning. Yeah, I slept in a little bit. Sorry about that. So here we are, Wednesday morning. Mike. I can't even do it. What day is it, Mike? It is Wednesday, October 9th. It is 9:05 in the morning here in Iowa. Do you know where your kids are? Do you know where your hazardous weather is? Well, I'm going to tell you and show you. So up there in Idaho, we have red flag warnings up. So, wouldn't it be cool if the National Weather Service actually flew red flags on days that there were red flag warnings? Anyway, dry, windy, high fire danger. Be careful there. Look at that little blue spot in West Virginia. It's a freeze watch. This temperature's getting colder. And then, of course, the big story today is Milton. I mean, that's just dominating everything. And we have hurricane warnings, hurricane watches, tropical storm warnings, tropical storm watches, a tornado watch, which is, being overwhelmed by all the other colors. But basically, take a line from just north of Tampa to Orlando and south. That's where the tornado watch is. And there's actually a tornado warning right now south of Lake Okeechobee. So things are happening as Milton draws near. So let's take a look at our satellite. Here we go. Had to set it up. All right. So this is the infrared satellite in motion. And as we take a look down, way down here, there's Milton churning away. Thankfully, Milton is weakening a little bit. We'll talk about that on the next graphic. But we already see, some of these outer bands are making their way into the peninsula. And with those outer bands is going to be that increased tornado potential. And there could be even some large tornadoes today. So that's a real threat, and that is already happening. Meanwhile, way up here in Canada, we've got some low pressure now. This is going to bring some cooler air south, and that's going to be welcome. So for Great Lakes, even parts of the Midwest, even later this weekend, getting some cooler air. But right now, we just see some little swirl in the atmosphere here. That's a low. And then we have another one offshore, Washington, throwing some clouds. Oregon, Washington, into parts of Montana. So a little bit of a system moving into the northwest. All right, let's take a closer look at Milton's particulars. This is 8 o'clock Eastern time, so a couple hours ago. But maximum sustained winds now 155 miles an hour. The update before that was 160. So coming down just a little bit, weakening just a little bit. That trend is expected to continue. So when we take a look at our Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale that I stole from a Channel 10 somewhere, probably on Facebook or something. Anyway, 160 was Category 5. 155 is a Category 4, like a very strong Category 4. Now, the winds are supposed to, again, get a little bit weaker as Milton gets a little bit closer. So we could end up with a Category 4, maybe a barely Category 4. There's a chance we can get into strong Category 3, which, would put us at 125 miles an hour, something like that, 130. We'll probably be around in there somewhere, maybe 140 even. So it's going to be still a catastrophic hurricane. And one of the biggest threats with landfalling hurricanes, besides the tornadoes going on today and the flooding, which is our next slide, is the storm surge it brings. So right along the coast, this is our updated storm surge. They just updated this at 8 o'clock Eastern time. So, we're looking at 10 to 15 feet storm surge from Anna Marie Island down to Boca Grande. And so that's where our biggest storm surge expected. Tampa Bay, just a densely populated area, 8 to 12 feet on the storm surge, just devastating. And so, this is going to cause a lot of damage along the coast. Of course, evacuations have been going swimmingly. It gets really crowded on the interstate. Some people have been running out of gas, bumper to bumper traffic, but people have been getting out of Dodge, which is good. Here is the rainfall amounts, the latest update on that as well. And so we see a swath from Tampa Bay to Orlando, or just slightly north of that. 12 to 16 inches of rain expected in this area, and just outside of that, 8 to 12 inches. So just a wide swath of nearly a foot of rain from Tampa Bay to Orlando. over to Melbourne. So Melbourne is Australia. Melbourne and Melbourne would be Florida. Anyway, it's going to be a lot of rain, obviously, and flooding is going to be, very dangerous. And of course, a lot of people are going to be without power and that sort of thing too. So we're praying for you, Florida. And our severe weather threat for today is Florida. Now, there's a slight chance of just regular thunderstorms from Kansas, Oklahoma, into the Texas Panhandle, but Florida is the main deal. And the main threat are your tornadoes. So, we have a 10% chance of tornadoes, Lake Okeechobee up through basically a line from Tampa Bay to Orlando, basically, is your 10% chance of tornadoes. And then there's the hatched area too, which has a little extra significance of possibly dangerous, or I should say larger tornadoes. So the threat is real. Even in the brown, the 5% goes all the way down to the Florida Keys, and the 2% a little bit further north of that. But much of the state of Florida under a risk of tornadoes today as Milton gets closer. So once again, Hurricane Milton moving northeast at 16 miles an hour, maximum sustained winds at 155. Probably be around 140 when it makes landfall. Looks like around 2 a.m. Thursday morning for landfall for Hurricane Milton. Surface for today, there's Milton, and there's your severe threat and flooding threat for Florida. Now you go all the way up into the northeast, and that low I showed you spinning in Canada is spreading some cooler air southward, and even a chance of some snow in New York State, Vermont, New Hampshire, into Maine, with some showers and some rain around that. And not to be outdone, the Pacific Northwest, with a chance for some snow in the Oregon Cascades and the Washington Cascades and the Olympic Mountains of Northwest Washington. Temperature anomalies today, that's where the cool stuff is. Northwest, slightly below average. Northeast, more below average. And same with the southeast. The center of the country is warm, especially the northern plains, just ridiculous. 20, 25 degrees above average for this time of year. And those temperatures in the northern plains, we're still talking 80s in North Dakota, South Dakota, into Nebraska and Iowa, also Montana and parts of Wyoming. Temperatures here should really be in the 60s this time of year. We're going to get there, but maybe not till Saturday or Sunday. Temperatures in the 80s in Kansas, Oklahoma, 90s when you get into Texas. Still hot desert Southwest. Our excessive heat warnings are gone, thankfully, but still topping 100. Phoenix into El Centro, California. 80s and 90s, central valleys of California, and then, of course, cooler up in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of 70s for the Midwest into the Mid-Atlantic, and even 60s when you get up into the Great Lakes and the Northeast. So that's where the cool stuff is. Lows tomorrow morning, 30s and 40s for the Great Lakes and for the Northeast. So, very pleasant here, very fall-like. Same with the Northwest, 40s and even some 30s. And then you get 50s to start the day into the plains, and then 60s when you get down into Texas and the Southeast. But desert Southwest still starting the day in the 70s. Tomorrow's surface, Milton on top of Florida. Again, lots of flooding. Hurricane force winds. Milton will weaken once it hits land, but it's going to stay a hurricane all the way across Florida. So there is that. So the threat continues tomorrow. Flooding, tornadoes, a hurricane, and so lots of wind, just dangerous conditions, obviously. All right, cold front through the mid-Atlantic, so cool north of that for the northeast, and the plains kind of in between fronts. So the backdoor front coming from the Great Lakes will affect some in the upper Midwest, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, and cooling off like the northeastern half of Iowa. But the southwestern part of Iowa, where I live, will stay on the warm side, along with the Dakotas, Wyoming, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, etc. Cooler than though for the northwest with the system moving on there. And so those anomaly temperatures again, 30 degrees above average for the Dakotas into Minnesota. 20 degrees above average where I live here in Iowa and in Nebraska. Teens above average for Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas and parts of Colorado. So just really warm in the center part of the country compared to average. And the cool stuff is the Northeast. So Northeast 10, 15 degrees below average. Very nice. And below average with our hurricane too in Florida, and then, slightly below average up and down the East Coast. Those highs look like this. So a lot of 70s, mid-Atlantic, Southeast, but transitioning into the 60s for Virginia, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, 50s now, and even some 40s up there in New Hampshire, Vermont, upstate New York, parts of Maine. Still baking in the plains, 90s, 80s to near 90 for South Dakota, 80s for Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas, and then 90s back in Texas. Still above 100 for southern Arizona, and then cooler up in the Pacific Northwest. Revisiting our 48-hour rainfall, we put it here because tomorrow's surface and tomorrow's temperatures, this is the rainfall ending Friday morning. So we see not much in the Northwest and not a lot up in the Northeast, maybe half inch or a little more for parts of upstate New York. But otherwise, the big story, of course, is Florida. And again, we're talking 8, 10, 12, 15 inches of rain across the center of the state. Here's what Friday looks like. Tropical storm Milton now moving into the Atlantic. Still scattered showers for Florida going on, and even a slight chance of tornadoes still in the wake of Milton. A little bit of light rain up there in Northern California, Southern Oregon. A little bit of light rain up there in the Northeast, scattered throughout the Great Lakes, scattered through the North Plains. But we are watching that cold front moving through the Dakotas now for a nice cool off into Nebraska. And the second half of the weekend is going to be nicer in these areas. Friday's highs are the anomalies, departure from average. Much cooler for North Dakota, South Dakota, only single digits above average. Still hanging on to 20 degrees above average for parts of Iowa, into Missouri, Illinois, Kansas, Oklahoma. Teens above average for Texas. So still warm, but starting to see some relief coming into the northern plains. And those highs on Friday for the northern plains, 60s like it's supposed to be, and then 70s as you get down into Nebraska. But, back to 80s and 90s for Kansas and Oklahoma, 90s for Texas. Meanwhile, the desert Southwest still over 100, Tucson 101. 80s for Central California, a lot of 70s for the Northwest, but some 60s scattered in there. Florida back into the 80s as the hurricane has now left. 70s, though, for much of the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, Ohio Valley, and then, cooling off as you head into the Northeast. All right, let's take a look at the GFS because I have that ready to go. And we'll start again with this morning. And there goes Milton. Kind of the only game in town. A little bit of snow up there in the Northeast, though. Look at that. It's snowing in upstate New York on this map. So this is this evening. And then as we get to about midnight, there's the hurricane making landfall. And that moves into Florida tomorrow. This is tomorrow morning. This is tomorrow afternoon. And just like that, Milton is exiting the state and taking a lot of the rain with it and moving into the Atlantic. So as we get into the day Friday, the country's pretty quiet. Now we're going to watch some stuff in Canada that's going to start spreading some colder air into the Great Lakes and especially into the Northeast. And that's going to be our pattern shift as we start to see things become more fall-like. So this is Sunday. We're starting to see a cool off now for the plains. Some of that colder air moving into Minnesota with some showers, Wisconsin too. And it's showing all rain here, but our 540 line is right here. So could be some snow mixing in with that for Wisconsin into Michigan as we get into the day Saturday, pulling some of that cooler air behind this low. So this is, good news if you like fall. if you live in the Great Lakes area into the Northeast, now we're starting to see more snow with this as we get into early Monday morning. And then that low lifts off into Canada, and the cool air settles into the Great Lakes, into parts of the plains and the Midwest. And that 540 line goes pretty far south. Look at that, into Kentucky. Nice cool off all the way down into Kentucky, the Virginias, even into North Carolina, that colder air. And so, it's going to be much cooler here, eastern half of the country, as we get into midweek. So this gets us into Wednesday here of next week. And then we have a Pacific Northwest storm bringing some rain for Oregon and Washington. How odd for them. Idaho into Montana. It is starting to be that time of year. Snow in the Cascades as we get into Thursday. And then into Friday, we're starting to see more tropical moisture moving into southern Florida. This would be Friday the 18th. So we're getting pretty far out there with the forecast. This is 9 days out. But just keep an eye out on some increased moisture for Florida and the southeast. And then also by the 19th, 20th, some colder air moving into the northern plains and the northwest. And maybe even, this little system we've been seeing on, varying in timing, but it keeps showing back up here. A little low forming in Colorado with some Colorado snow. This has it around the 19th or 20th. So, as we get into next weekend, we might see that kind of a cool off with some of the colder air moving in to the northern plains. We'll keep an eye on that as we go. Looking at your weekend, starting to cool off northern plains, but still well above average for most of the plains, especially Kansas, Oklahoma, into Texas and Missouri. A little bit cooler northern California, and a little bit cooler as we head into the Northeast. Highs on Saturday, still 90s, Texas, Oklahoma, into Kansas, but 70s now for Iowa and Nebraska. So cooling off to start the weekend. As we get into Sunday, even cooler for the northern plains, upper Midwest, Great Lakes, into the Northeast. So temperatures starting to get 10, 15 degrees below average. Very nice. And still staying above average Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and much of the West. Highs on Sunday, 60s Iowa, we'll take it. 50s North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, even some 40s as you get towards the Canadian border. 40s northern Wisconsin into the UP of Michigan. 50s and 60s for Michigan. And we see 50s mainly for upstate New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, but a few 40s up there in northern Maine. And mid-Atlantic, we'll call it near 80 for Raleigh, North Carolina. Some low 80s for the southeast. And California, a little bit cooler. Low 80s for the central California valleys. And a little bit cooler for the southwest. But still 100 for Phoenix. They just can't shake that. Looking ahead for the 6 to 10 day temperatures, this is the 14th through the 18th, and we see that trend for much below average for the mid-Atlantic into parts of the Midwest up into the Northeast. So the western third, a little more than that, or eastern third, a little more than that, with a chance for below average temperatures for the 14th through the 18th. The west still above average. And precipitation just looks terrible. It just looks dry almost everywhere. The exception would be Florida and for the Northwest. All right, there you go. Hurricane Milton doing its thing. It'll be hitting Florida late tonight, overnight tonight. So we're praying for those folks, and the evacuations are continuing. And then it's starting to cool off for the Northeast. Fall is coming. It's just been a little delayed for the plains and really for much of the country, but we're going to start to see that pattern change, especially as we get into the second half or the third week of October. And we'll be right here to keep you posted as we go. So I really do appreciate you. Thank you so much for tuning in. The Weather Mike.